All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Jerch, and I'm the Associate Vice President of the Center for Policy and Practice at the Association of Community College Trustees. And I'm glad you're joining us here today to learn about a topic that is important in supporting the work that you do at community colleges. First, I just want to mention a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send out a link to the webinar, to the recording, out to the registrants, as well as posting it on our website, which you will learn details of at the very end. If you have questions during our presentation, please use the chat function. We'll be monitoring those and try to get to as many as possible during our question and answer session. So today, our agenda is going to cover, I'm going to do some introductions for our presenters today. We're going to talk a little bit about why this is important. We're going to introduce you to the Student Success through Applied Research Lab. We're going to talk a little bit about a brief that we're releasing today, and launching our dashboard will wrap up our presentation, and then we'll take some questions and answers. So I just want to say I'm joined by some fantastic presenters today. Ji-Heng Lee is our president and CEO at ACCT. Dr. Nick Hillman is a professor in educational leadership and policy analysis and directs the Student Success through Applied Research Lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Amberly Dzinski is a researcher in the Student Success through Applied Research Lab, and her work focuses on equity in higher education, finance, college access through financial aid, and policymaking processes. So it's no secret that community colleges hold a unique place and serve as anchors in their communities. As their role to be all things to all people continues to grow, they are often asked to do more with less. Over the last 6 months, we have been working on an exciting project that starts to explore how community colleges are funded based on the type of student group: credit-bearing, non-credit, and dual enrollment. Today, we are releasing a research brief that explores how states fund each of these enrollment groups, as well as launching a dashboard that will be housed on our website that can be a tool for starting conversations in your community. Before we get started, I want to say thanks to Lumina Foundation for supporting this project. They continue to be a supporter of the work community colleges do and have been a great longtime partner of ACCT. I would also like to thank our partners at the STAR Lab for their great work on this project, and AACC and SHIO for supporting and sharing this work. Now I want to turn it over to our president and CEO, Ji-Heng Lee, to give some opening remarks and talk a bit about why we did this project and how colleges can use this information. Ji-Heng?
Thank you, Steve, and welcome everyone that's participating and joining us in on this this webinar this afternoon. As Steve mentioned, this work is crucial to the trajectory of our nation's community colleges. As Steve mentioned, the community, as part of the community college work, ensures that we do everything for our local communities and our localities. But that also means that we as a sector need to look systematically at how our institutions are funded. And over the course of my travels as the president and CEO of the Association of Community College Trustees, one thing has become blatantly clear. Our states and our localities, but especially our governors, are looking towards our nation's community colleges to do a wide variety of activities. But that doesn't necessarily mean the funds are coming down to our nation's community colleges. So as we started to take a look at how our colleges are being funded, we want to really systematically take a look at how our associate degree programs are being funded, our non-credits especially are being funded at our institutions, and also dual enrollment, as dual enrollment has systematically been increasing at our institutions. This is important so that we as a sector can take a look at each of our states, but also allows our opportunity for our state leaders to take a look at what other states are doing to ensure that there's some type of equity that is occurring within all of our community colleges across state borders. So one of the things that we wanted to ensure was that our state leaders, whether or not they're from the Northeast, the Southeast, the Mid-Atlantic, can compare with each other on how states are supporting each of our community colleges locally. I am very thankful that the Lumina Foundation was willing to support this project, but I'm also very thankful for our partners at the University of Wisconsin STAR Labs for their support and participation and leadership on this project. We are hopeful to do additional work in this area, but we do think it's quite crucial for us to really start to document these funding opportunities that are provided to our institutions. And we are hopeful that our state leaders and our governors will step up to the plate and especially support areas around non-credit access for our institutions and especially for our students. I will turn this back over to Steve.
Thanks, Jihang. I appreciate that. And I now want to turn it over to the team from the STARS Lab, who were the main partners on this project. They did all the heavy lifting and produced some really great information. So.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Jihang. This project has been a real, just wonderful opportunity to learn with you. My name is Nick Hillman. I'm a professor in the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and direct the STAR Lab. On campus, we call research centers labs oftentimes, so don't let the name fool you. We're a research center. We are embedded in the Division of Enrollment Management, so we really make sure that our research that we do connects directly to practices related to financial aid, admissions, access, and student success. Here on this slide is our mission, and the lab is all about producing but also elevating research that reduces barriers, improves equity, and supports students in all parts of higher education. We do this through partnerships, as this project was one through our partnership with ACCT. And we really want to make sure that the work that we do is relevant and useful in the field, whether that's for policy or for practice. I have one more slide here, and then I'll hand everything over to Dr. Dazinski. The background, as Jihang already had said, is really, I think, motivating and important. And again, we're focusing on just how do states fund credit, non-credit, and dual enrollment programs. And we want to understand, how do these balance out with respect to other financial resources of colleges? Community colleges, these seem like straightforward questions to answer, but they have not been answered in the field. There's a large gap, both on the research side of just understanding what's going on in the states, but also on the practice side and policy side, as Jihang said, of being able to compare what other states are doing and to learn from one another. Steve also mentioned that this project has been ongoing for 6 months. And for folks who have been involved with similar kind of research projects, 6 months is not a long time to get a lot done. So kudos to Amberly and our doctoral research assistant, Anji Yu, who is a PhD student at UW-Madison, on really leading this work and getting this information documented for the field. We can only build on this. And so we'll say throughout the presentation here that this is a first step, a first of many steps moving us forward as a field to understand how these funding models work in community colleges. So a little bit more background on the prior research here. These 3 bullet points are really the main ones. The first one is that it's well documented across research literature that funding helps boost student success. More resources for colleges help colleges have the capacity that they need to meet students' needs. And many of the inequities we see in student outcomes, it ties directly back to where the funding comes from, how much funding is available. So there's a direct through line here. The second bullet point here is that there just exists no central clearinghouse for state funding models at community colleges. So like I said, we're trying to document that, and you'll see in this demonstration, in this report, how we've done it. And again, we're trying to help build out this infrastructure for the US. And the third one here is that there is just no central data set on enrollment and non-credit and dual enrollment courses. In the data tool, as we'll see later, we use IPEDS data, the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data Systems from the US Department of Education, and that has its limitations. And so I think there are lots of opportunities to build our data infrastructure and improve it, but also use what we have and learn from it so that we at least can set some baselines as we've done in this project. And so with that said, our research team and truly Amberly and Anji, our team over here in the lab, have just done a big heavy lift in partnership with ACCT and our funding partners. And we just really appreciate being able to contribute to this work on creating a first look inventory of each state's funding approaches. So Amberly, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks to ACCT for having us today and for all of you for joining us to learn about this work. I'm going to talk through some of the methodology that we did, our findings, give some specific policy examples, and then walk you through the dashboard that we've produced. And I believe this is a first look at the report, which we're launching today, that you'll be able to read on the ACCT website for some more information. So we conducted a policy inventory, and so in practice, what that meant was we looked at state policies in all 50 states, including some territories as well, and we reviewed their statutes, budget documents, administrative codes, policy documents, website, all of this exhaustive list of resources to try to figure out how states are funding community colleges for these different enrollment populations. So students who are credit bearing, students who are dual enrolled, and students who are non-credit students. We conducted, like I said, across the 50 states. We, as researchers, kind of calibrated what we were counting in our definitions, which I'll get to in the next slide, and as well as reached out to some of you who might be on the call to get some insights into what's going on in your different states. As Nick mentioned, our goal was really a broad overview. This is a first look at these different funding for enrollment populations. So we're not trying to compile an exhaustive list, but I think it will give you a good idea of different ways that states are funding these enrollment populations and hopefully spark some conversation about what more your state could be doing to support community colleges. As we were searching through the policies, we have some definitions that we were using for these terms, credit-bearing, dual enrollment, and non-credit, that we pulled from iPads as well as some prior research in this area on what these terms mean. I think we'll get to it, but one of the kind of key takeaways is there's not a lot of clarity around these terms. People are using them in different ways, and that can create some confusion. So these are the terms that we are using, and that will be reflected in the results that we see. So there might be some other policies out there that we either didn't find or didn't fit these definitions that could be great for your state and for funding. And we'd love to hear about them, by the way, if we have missed something. So here's our key map that shows which states are funding these different populations. And what we found is all states are funding credit-bearing activities. So that's your bread and butter, right? Your students who are working towards a degree or a credit-bearing certificate, right? Within a community college. And then 35 states are funding dual enrolled students. So these are students that are working towards high school credit and college credit at the same time through the community college. So not programs like AP or anything like that. And then non-credit programs. And we used a broad definition of non-credit programs, so including things like vocational education, as well as adult basic skills, English language learning, and community recreation, kind of anything that could fall under that really broad umbrella. And again, our goal was like, is there something, right? So we found 22 states have funding for all three of these groups, which is good, but it is less than half, right? So there is a long ways to go for states to make sure that their community colleges are funded in a way that reflects the varied mission of all of these different enrollment populations, right? We also looked beyond is it funded or not to see if there are specific mechanisms or approaches or funding for the way that the funding gets to the institutions, right? So common methods that we saw in different states are, enrollment-based formula. So that could be, there's like a per student formula that the that the state offers for community colleges. Performance-based funding would be, offering an incentive or rewarding institutions based on specific outcomes. Institutional requests kind of ties in some states, the institutions based on their different enrollment populations will make a request to the legislature for a specific amount. Special purpose funding is like more programmatic. So it's something, funding that goes specifically towards this program or this, we see this particularly in the non-credit space, funding for those particular activities. And then tuition reimbursements we see specifically for dual enrollment criteria, dual enrollment programs where often in many states, as you probably know, students don't pay tuition, and so the state reimburses that. Important to note that for the dual enrollment, a lot of states fund dual enrollment through K-12. We didn't capture that in this inventory. So you might see, oh, my state didn't show up for dual enrollment credit, and we do fund dual enrollment really well. So that's something to keep in mind, and keep in mind also that there might be additional costs associated with these programs that might not be covered through that. So I wanted to give some specific examples of states where we're seeing these different types of mechanisms play out. So I'll start with this enrollment-based formula in Arizona. So Arizona, the way that the funding works is the institutions do make that request, and that request is based on an expenditure per FTE that the institutions calculate. And the statute is pretty clear on how this calculation should take place. So there is the formula includes both, as you would expect, right? The credit units that students are taking, calculated as an FTE. And then it's also clear that it includes skill centers, clock hours, vocational training programs. So those non-credit students are still able to count in the FTE definition. And this type of policy where there's like an enrollment-based or FTE or credit-based kind of formula is fairly common. We see a similar type of policy in California, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And because many states use an enrollment-based formula, this is a pretty straightforward place to look. Oh, if we're funded on a per student basis, who counts? Who counts in that formula? Are dual enrolled students counting? Are non-credit students counting? So that's a kind of first place to start. Next, we've got Wisconsin here with an example of performance-based funding, which is fairly common as well, where we're seeing this funding for non-credit and dual enrolled students in particular. And sometimes that was through, the FTE, similar as what I was just talking about. And some states have separate metrics for these different enrollment populations. So in Wisconsin, number of degrees and certificates, right? That's capturing your credit-bearing students. Then you have the number of adult students served by basic education courses, adult high school or English language learning. And so that counts as the kind of non-credit stuff. And then participation in dual enrollment programs, of course, captures funding for dual enrollment. And so as separate criteria, these students can receive, the state can fund institutions in different levels for these different populations. And it was beyond the scope of this project to look at if this funding is enough, right? Or like if the different premium for these different populations made sense, right? Like beyond the scope of this project, but something we hope to look at in the future and can kind of open that conversation in the state. And then the next example here is Illinois. So again, this is kind of like the more separate out funding, similar to the performance-based funding, but on a really kind of specific basis where the state is funding, so this first example is for dual enrollment. So it's offers community college districts funding to expand their services and lower costs for high school students in college level courses. So there's dual enrollment funding available. And then for non-credit, there's a competitive grant to support non-credit training and business solution initiatives. And what I want to point out about this second example, this non-credit, is they're really clear on what type of non-credit they are including, right? So as I mentioned, we used a broad definition of non-credit when we were looking for examples, but in some states, there might be different types of non-credit programs that you politically care more about or want to make sure are funded, right? And so this one is clear, oh, we're excluding those community enrichment, adult education, English language learning, those types of classes. Is really focused on the kind of workforce development type of non-credit programs. All right, so some key takeaways from this. And I will say also, we've got specific examples for all of the states that we'll show you when we get to the dashboard. So as I mentioned, most states don't fully fund the enrollment mission of the full enrollment missions of community colleges, right? So we've only got those 22 who are addressing all three of those groups. So we've got some work to do. As I mentioned, again, a lack of clarity around what these terms mean or around who is included can lead to unequal funding. So we've heard from some institutional leaders who in their state, it's not clear whether you can include dual enrollment or not, or some institutions are including dual enrollment students in their calculation of FTE and others aren't. And that can lead to a situation where it's unequal, right? It might be unfair for those institutions that are or aren't counting. And then inconsistent definitions can make advocacy difficult, right? So as community colleges are looking for more resources to fully fund the mission of these different enrollment populations, right? It's important to think about making sure everyone is on the same page with what these terms mean. And again, our goal is to open a conversation with this, right? So you might see things in your state or know about things that we haven't found. So that's a great place to kind of start to think about what's happening in your state and to point out in the conversations between policy makers and institutional leaders and all of those who are involved in those decisions. And again, this is a first pass at this work, right? There's a lot more to know about funding for these populations, including district funding, as I mentioned, right? That K-12 funding for dual enrollment is really important. We didn't address that. There's other enrollment populations who are a really important part of community college missions that it would be good to know if they're funded. We don't know the impact or the effectiveness of these different funding policies, right? Or as I mentioned, if this funding is really adequate, right? So we're opening the conversation and hoping that along with you all, we can keep it going. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. And the first part of this project, right, was this inventory. We looked at all of the state policies, who is funding institutions for dual enrolled students and non-credit students. And then the second part is this dashboard. And this dashboard gives those inventory results, but they also give a new data visualization for some IPEDS data that will help us understand state, local, and tuition revenue to see kind of the balance of where these resources are coming from. So I believe, yes. Okay, so I'm just going to walk through this and then it will be on the website for you all to kind of explore on your own. So we've got our map here again showing which states are doing which. And then down here we have specific can you still see that? Can I get a thumbs up from somebody? Thanks, Nick. All right. So we've got our, on the bottom here, the policies in each state. And we will have this linked to a table as well that you can click on the specific statutes and get more information on those, but you can scroll through all of the states. But you might say, okay, but I only want to look at my state, right? So let's take a look at a specific example here. I'm from Michigan, so I'm going to pull up Michigan on this graph. And I'm going to add in institutions. If you click this button, you'll see where all of the community colleges are located. And you'll also be able to see some additional funding information about that institution. So I like to use Alpena Community College as an example. Once upon a time, I was a dual enrolled student there, got to take some political science classes that weren't offered at my high school, and got to get some of those credits out of the way before going on to my bachelor's degree. So that was good for me. I appreciate it. So then from here, this page again is kind of like, what is my state funding in terms of these 3 enrollment populations? When we go to the next tab, the question is, how does my state compare to other states? And so on this view, we can see a graph of all of the states and the total. Right now, we've got total state appropriations, but we can switch that to a different metrics. So we have this broken out as total per FTE and per head count to be able to see in different contexts, these different measures might be more applicable, right? And then you can look at state, local, and tuition dollars. It's important to note that we're using IPED's data for this analysis. So in an ideal world, we would be able to say this institution or this state funds dual enrolled students this much and non-credit students this much. We don't have that information. It's not yet collected. So there's an advocacy piece too, like getting better data on even the counts of dual enrolled or non-credit. We're still working on those things. But with IPED's data, they only have degree seeking headcount, right? So even this, when we do funding per student, it doesn't include dual enrolled students. It doesn't include non-credit students, right? So this will give you kind of a broad picture of funding, but in the future, we hope to drill down more specifically as data become available. And then on the bottom here, there we go. You can see the trend over time. And if you click on a specific state, you'll be able to see the funding over time for that state and to see kind of the distribution of state, local, and tuition revenue. So this says, what our state's doing what's our state doing compared to other states. The next asks, what is our institution doing compared to other institutions? And so on this view, we can see kind of the relationship between these different finance metrics. And all of these dots are specific community colleges in here. So we can look at, for example, maybe we want to see the relationship between state appropriations per degree seeking student and state appropriations per or local funding per FTE, right? So we can kind of see what that trend looks like. And then if we want to look at a specific state, again, I'll choose Michigan. We're going to see where that distribution is, see which states are maybe up here that would be highly funded on state appropriations and local appropriations, and which ones are less so. And we can also include four-year colleges in this view too, to get a sense of what that looks like. And then at the bottom here, we can see funding rank by percentiles. So what that means is if you're lining up all of the institutions in a row, right, you can see which ones are having the greatest and which ones are having the least, and get the percentile ranks. So if we look here at, let's do state appropriations per FTE, we can see the distribution. And so a college again, Alpena Community College right here is in the 93rd percentile when we look at per FTE funding. So that means 93% of colleges are receiving less funding per FTE than Alpena Community College. And there might be good reasons for this, these differences across community colleges. There might be, enrollment might be one, mission might be otherwise. Like there's a lot of reasons that there might be differences. And so we hope that kind of seeing it in this way, you can start to talk about, well, is dual enrollment funding part of that disparity, or is non-credit enrollment and offerings part of that as well? So lots to play around with on this, which we hope you do, and we hope that it really opens a conversation with your state. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Steve.
Thank you, Amberly. So we are at our point. We've seen some really good questions come in. And so I just want to, first of all, thank Nick and Amberly for that great information. As a reminder, please use the chat function. And I will start posing some of these questions that we've seen. So the first question is, sorry if you explained this, but did you direct this survey to systems office, or did it go directly to colleges? So I think, where did the information come from?
Yeah, so we decided not to do like a traditional survey where we would send out a survey to institutions or state leaders to get responses. Instead, we searched statutes and budget documents. So it was really a survey of documents rather than a survey of people.
Perfect. So we have another question. Are you assuming that credit-bearing students and dual enrollment students are mutually exclusive, or that students are enrolled in both credit and not credit? So what happens if the student body they're taking a mixture of courses?
Yeah, so we looked at the funding that would go towards the type of like towards like the student as opposed to the type of program that they're in, right? So a student could be enrolled in non-credit and be a degree-seeking student, right? So they're in credit classes as well, right? And so we were focused not on funding per like the designation that the student has, but like towards the type of course that the student is in.
I see. Okay. No, that's very helpful. So this next question is in relation to that. So when you look at the funding by enrollment type or funding approaches, based on what you found in your research, what would you consider to be the gold standard of funding models for states to consider? Like, did you find anything like this state funds all three categories equally, so therefore that's the best model, or what did you find?
That's a great question, right? We did those examples that I gave, right, where you have a state that's just simply making sure that all three of these groups are included in their definition of FTE. As I mentioned, that's kind of like a pretty baseline, right? But I think there's definitely ways to go beyond that. And so we do point to some of those examples where there's recognition that the cost of, say, dual enrollment programs, right? Like, there's coordination that's required between the campus and the high school, right? That is beyond like a per student course cost, right? And so programs or funding policies that are helping build capacity of institutions in that way, I think are really a promising approach. Nick, is there anything you'd add?
No.
No, that's very helpful. So you touched on this a little bit, but and this question is specific for New Mexico. So one of the things they're looking to do is source some sustainable, predictable funding for non-credit workforce training. And I know there are states that do that differently. the data that you found for non-credit, did not separate out adult basic ed from like the workforce training programs from the other types, correct? It was just sort of a collective, and that's just based on, you know, what the scope of this work was. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. And a number of the examples are that you can kind of read through in the funding on the dashboard. You'll see that a number of them are, you know, funding for adult basic education, right? And so I think we could, you know, potentially look to that as a model of, well, if you're doing it for adult basic education, literacy programs, those other non-credit programs, like why not for this too, right? There's in your state, you might see that you have a model already in place.
No, yeah, that's what I was thinking, and I think that's a good thing to point out. So here's another interesting question. So did you see any change in funding for those states that allowed community colleges to confer bachelor's degrees? I don't know if you ran across any instance where, you know, certain states that allow bachelor degree at the community college level, like they received a higher percentage of a certain type of funding.
Yeah, we didn't look specifically at that. This is a good time to point out also that some of these programs and policies that we found might not even fund all of the institutions that are within the state and all the community colleges, right? Like particularly some of these like special purpose funding, right? It might even only go to a couple of institutions, and that was still counted as a yes in our criteria. So that's something that's worth looking at too, is again, getting at like the adequacy of these policies is like, is it reaching the campuses that are all of the campuses that need it?
Thanks. This question deals with performance-based. Is there a way to highlight how many states fully fund based on performance-based rather than enrollment?
Yeah, Nick might have some insight into that one. I'll throw that over to you.
We do not currently differentiate those in the mapping tool. However, I believe that the research team over at Informed States might have an updated list of performance funding models that maybe we could consider tying on to our data set. It's an answerable question, I think, but we do not answer it in this report.
Yeah, and in the report, we also have additional resources, including the Informed States brief and research that Nick was just mentioning, because the scope of ours was like more narrow, right? And we know that there are these bigger picture questions. So hopefully those resources that are in the report will be able to point you in that direction.
Thanks. You did speak to this point, talking about how sometimes dual enrollment didn't show up because they were funded through a different mechanism like K through 12. Do you have an estimate of how many states fund through the K through 12 system? Were you able to, or did you run across any information around that?
That I don't know. More than a handful is what I would say, but that wasn't something that we collected consistently, so I couldn't put a number on that.
Did you get a sense of, another question was, did you get a sense of, are there certain non-credit programs that were more likely to be funded? I'm not sure if you were able to, I don't know if they called out specific things in some of the statutes, or anything like that.
Yes, so we did see a lot of the adult basic skills, you know, GED, English language learning, like that type of program. We've heard called like the pre-college courses. So there were a lot of those. And part of the trick with the non-credit programs is those are very obviously non-credit programs, right? So they're pretty easy to find when we're looking through statutes, whereas some other, you know, some states have really robust vocational or workforce training programs, but it's really unclear if they're non-credit or not, right? So that was difficult to navigate just from the research perspective, right? So I would say our collection process probably helped us find more of those programs that are the adult basic skills courses. But because that was the most common one, I think that we were able to find.
So here's a question from Wisconsin, actually. So this individual mentions that that there are disparities that exist from the high performing versus low performing colleges and the impact it has on overall funding for the college. Do you or Nick have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, so we didn't look at institutional performance around this, except when we were looking at policies that are like the performance-based funding, right? So the example that I gave, right, where in Wisconsin, that list of metrics that's in the statutes for performance-based funding, the one for dual enrollment, right, is just like participation in dual enrollment, right? So I'm assuming that just means like the number of students, right? It's not based on those student outcomes. But then the non-credit example from Wisconsin was like both enrollment in those courses as well as success in those courses, right? So by the nature of however those like the dollars attached to those different criteria, higher performing institutions would likely receive more dollars.
So just a jump back to the K-12 question. And I apologize if I asked this already. Is there a sense of how common that approach is, K through 12 versus funding dual enrollment directly through the colleges?
Yeah, I don't have a sense of that, of how common it is.
No, that's very helpful. Did you get a sense of where community colleges in any of your conversations, where they were looking to fill these funding gaps? Like, did you come across any literature that was, well, we're gonna have to make up this gap through fundraising or grant applications? Was there any common theme there, or was it just sort of all over the place?
Yeah, so something that we've heard that I find pretty interesting from policymakers is that there is often an unwillingness or an unfeasibleness. It's not feasible to always change a funding formula or to insert new criteria into a performance-based funding metrics, right? Like that just politically is not viable, or our formula is only readdressed every 5 years, right? And like we need something now, right? And so that's where I have heard some states thinking more about this special purpose funding and doing things on a more like categorical basis, which can also be politically viable because it's often more transparent than resources that are just going to a general fund. And so a policymaker can say, I funded this program at your institution, at your community college, right? So there's a political viability argument to be made there. There's also just some recent work that's come out on categorical funding that it can be subject to just like the political wills, right? Of, as I just mentioned, like we want funding to come to our community college, and sometimes or when it's a competitive grant or something like that, right, can kind of reinforce inequities if there are institutions that have the capacity to apply for those grants or not apply to them.
Oh, no, that's helpful. We did have another question actually from another University of Wisconsin, Madison question. Was there any indication of resources allocated toward undocumented students? Like any of the statutes, they carved out some specific language or anything like that?
Yeah, we didn't look specifically for that. So that wasn't really something that we saw, but definitely an important population that, like, if we were expanding on this work, could incorporate.
Thank you. Let me see what other questions we have coming in. I think we've gotten to most of the questions. please, we'll just take a minute or two to provide some opportunity to let some people ask any additional questions that they have. So feel free to ask. We've gotten some great responses. There was a question earlier. So there was a question earlier around Iowa, and I know we had some conversations about this in the past about how, and is that due to the whole K-12, how it's funded? Is that why it didn't show up in some of the data collection?
Yeah, Iowa was one of those states that funds through K-12. So it has that, potentially pretty robust funding for dual enrollment students, but because it comes through K-12, we didn't capture that. Yeah, Nick?
Yes, Nick.
I would just add that, again, to Amberly and our team here for doing this work in 6 months time. I mean, there are years of potential opportunities to continue this work. So the feedback that we're getting in the chat and those comments like from Iowa and these examples, we love to hear those. And that's exactly what I think we want to, share this with, as Amberly said earlier. So I just wanted to affirm that, be sure that, we're making an open invitation, and we really appreciate that kind of feedback. It's good.
Yeah, and I think one of the purposes we did this, and we knew this going in, is this was going to, as I think Nikki's mentioned before, the tip of the iceberg, right? This is something that's getting the conversation started. We know that there's a lot of data sets out there that are underdeveloped that we need to leverage and to do a deeper dive into this kind of stuff. So I think this is a good, both an informational tool, but also an advocacy tool for better data collection. So we've had some additional questions come in. One is, what about funding from community college Hispanic serving institutions? Have you seen any sort of carve outs for more specific demographic student facing institutions?
Yeah, at the student level, a number of states have funding formula, either those like enrollment-based formula or performance-based formula that do provide what we call like a premium. So like there's an extra dollar on top for students from racially underrepresented minority populations and low-income students, adult learners. Like different states have, different priorities that they're working towards, and often based on where there are outcomes gaps. So we do see that in funding policies. And then the federal government has resources that go to institutions based specifically on those designations, the like HSI, MSI, HBCU, which, it wasn't something we were looking for at the state level, but the federal, the federal policies could be something that a state could follow.
Yeah. Did you, another question came in around, I don't necessarily know that it would be part of the data set that you collected, but you may have run across this. Did you notice or see any sort of legislation, federal, state, looking at overall funding for technical colleges relative to the growth of undocumented residents and special circumstances funding for these potential students? I guess maybe, yeah, in a broader sense, just funding for undocumented students, any sort of legislative initiatives.
Yeah, that wasn't something that we collected during our data analysis. And I think overall, just reading, we read through these policies with an eye for these groups, but made a mental note. And I'm not recalling any policies that come to mind related to undocumented students.
No, that's helpful. This is a question around sort of your methodology versus another project. And so it's, have you looked at the work ECS has done on state funding, and is your methodology different? I don't know what the ECS work is, so I hope you do.
Yeah, the ECS, we reference their work and use it to kind of compare our results against theirs, and also included those as resources in the report. So that's a great spot to look at for, they go more in depth than just funding for, like, so their dual enrollment report, I think, came out in 2020, I want to say, that they look at who's eligible, who's, just like these other aspects of the policy that aren't funding related. So that's a great resource for looking beyond funding. And I will say also, as we were working on this, these policies are changing. Like that report that came out a couple of years ago, some of these states have since changed their funding mechanisms. And so it is a kind of a constant battle to stay on top of what all of these states are doing. And so that's what makes the work that they're doing and this work as well really important to continue doing.
No, I agree. What about any encounter with legislation similar to California's 50% rule that effectively limits community colleges' flexibility and their ability to fund non-full-time faculty costs?
I'm not familiar with that one. I think I'd have to do a little bit more research. Nick, do you have any insights?
Unfortunately, no. This is very helpful, though.
Okay, let's see. I think we've got time for probably one, maybe two more questions. So will there be opportunities for states to help verify the respective data as the study progresses? I think, Nick, you addressed this a little bit, saying that, we welcome feedback. And so I think they pointed out some specific Michigan examples as part of this question.
Yeah, our inboxes are open. So yeah, please send us along. And sometimes, like we said, like sometimes it's the methodology of our collection, like the places that we were looking for these policies that we might have missed something. And sometimes it's the way that we've defined these terms that could have led to something to be excluded or not.
Well, I think I'm not saying, oh, wait. I wasn't a question, it was a kudos. So I think that's a great opportunity to come to a close. And I want to say thank you again to Nick and Amberly from the STAR Lab for that fantastic presentation, and our president and CEO, Jihang Lee, for his continued leadership on behalf of community colleges. So you can visit our website using this QR code or the URL to access both the brief and the dashboard. And I understand we've had some improperly working links, so we'll make sure we clean those up today. But they will live on our website. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. We will be sending out this recording along with the slide deck later this week, and then it will be living on our the recording will be uploaded to our website probably in the next week or so. So again, thank you very much, and do not hesitate to reach out with any questions. Thanks, everyone.